Hey there, this is Jonah with Gray Area. Welcome to our series Spotlight, where our mission is to build a bigger and more united house music community by sharing new and exciting artists, festivals, and event brands with you. In this interview, you'll hear from Eelke Kleijn, an icon in the world of melodic house / techno, as well as a label manager for the legendary Days Like Nights labels. Be sure to like this video and subscribe for more interviews like this. So, first thing I just ask everybody is whether you have a moment, from your childhood or kind of early adulthood where you feel like you really fell in love with dance music.
Yeah, definitely. From, I guess from when I was I remember when I was like 7 or 8 years old, I had my first double cassette deck, and I would record songs from the radio. And I was mostly making mixtapes with dance music that was on the radio at that time. So that would have been Euro dance, like Hathaway and those kind of acts. I was always taping that and then, changing the order on a different tape and all of that. So I think that's where the fascination comes from.
That's amazing. That's a young start for you.
Yeah, it's pretty much as young as I can remember, like before that, I don't really remember clearly being that interested in music. But as soon as those Eurodance songs came out, like early 90s, 90, 91, I was kind of hooked on that. And that, I was 7 or 8 at the time. So that was the start of it all, I guess.
Definitely. Do you have a memory of the first time you played, whether it was like just to your friends or an actual show, as a professional?
Yeah, there was this one gig. I was in high school, and I guess it's quite vague by now, but it was this friend's birthday party that I played at, and they rented all these equipment for me that I just knew existed, but I'd never used it before, So I was sort of trying to find my way on this double Denon CD deck, on the spot. So from what I remember, it wasn't my greatest performance, but it was definitely fun, getting into it. And I guess I was maybe 14 or something at the time, maybe 15. Yeah.
That's funny. I think a lot of people I talk to have an experience like that where you just get thrown into the deep end and it's like, I've never used CDJs before. I guess I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah.
Someone like yourself, obviously, and it's something I want to get into later, but you just recently kind of debuted this pretty extensive live performance. But I know that, that's not the only way you perform. So I'm just curious, from a fan perspective, for those who don't know you, what can they expect when they come to see you live?
Well, when it's a live show, it'll be just my own music, and I'll be performing them live at that moment. So it's usually about 90 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer. But it's just my own music with my synthesizers and my laptop. And then when I do a DJ show, it's different. I play other people's music as well. And those shows are usually longer. I prefer to play, 3 or more hours because it gives me more time to sort of connect with the crowd and really get into the music. And they're both different in their own way. And I've come to like both quite a lot, when you've done a lot of DJ gigs, it's really fun to do a live gig and vice versa.
Absolutely. Kind of on that, and maybe the preference on this question depends on whether you're performing live or doing a DJ set, but between, playing at a huge festival or, a really large venue versus like an intimate club, do you have a preference on those? And is there any that, you really like to do, even though they're more occasional for you?
Yeah, I've always maintained my opinion that my personal preference is definitely the smaller club sort of shows. And that doesn't mean necessarily a small amount of people, but anywhere where you still get that intimate sort of vibe. So I've had shows where there were over maybe 2,000 people, but everyone's still like right on top of you, with the DJ booth being so on the same level as the dance floor and being, just in front of those people, and that gives it a really big, a really intimate vibe. And my worst sort of gig is the one where you are very lonely on a really big stage with all these lights right on top of you. And I guess I'm just a bit of an introvert, and I don't like to be in the spotlight that much, you know. So and by now I've become accustomed to them, and I know how to play them, but my preference will always be those more intimate shows.
Definitely. I mean, I know, it's something that it's kind of, I've heard that feedback from other people, and it is interesting because I think from a fan perspective, when you look at a DJ on one of these, mega stages at a festival or, huge event, it can often feel like, oh my God, that looks amazing. I can't even imagine that feeling. But at the same time, from your perspective, it's probably very difficult to connect with the crowd when you're 50 feet away from them and it's above and it's just like the tops of people's heads. Going all the way back, kind of early 2000s and maybe even late 90s, you were producing some music under different aliases. I think it was Midor and 648. It was pretty like hard trance and definitely very different from what we associate with you now. I was just curious if you could touch on that and, who was inspiring you then and kind of what made you decide to go away from that?
So when I was 18 and I had sort of decided I wanted to start producing music, I was still, back then trance was the biggest sound, so I was definitely inspired by that. And some of my earliest inspirations were of course Chesto and Ferry and Armin. So that was definitely something I liked at the time. And so I was 18 and I got into touch with this other guy, Rutger van Bostelen. And he was very much into trance as well. And he said, well, maybe we could do this project. And that was the Midor and 648 that you referenced. So I, as someone who had never released a record and he had never done one either, we started making music, and that took off really surprisingly quickly. It got onto Chesto's playlist and Armin's playlist, and those records were doing quite well. So from releasing nothing, we were all of a sudden releasing 10, 12 records. Oh, give me 1 second. Someone just called me right in front of her. Yeah. So should we do this whole bit again, or?
No, we can still hear you. It's all good.
Cool. No, so from being a duo that didn't release any records at all, we went to releasing like 10, 12 records in a year, And so I went with that flow for 1 or 2 years, but it got kind of stale for me. There wasn't a lot of progression. I didn't feel like I was really doing the music that I loved because I was already getting inspired by people like Sander Kleinenberg and Nick Warren and John Digweed and, lower tempos, more progressive house. And so after 3 or so years, I put an end to that project, and Rutger, the other guy, continued on his own. And I sort of went my own way and I started releasing music under my own name, which I'm still doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really trying to dig into kind of the early years of Eelke Kleijn releases. And it was interesting. I felt like, from kind of 2003 to 2009, there were a lot of different sounds. Your first couple EPs, like 45 Billion Years and Deeper Depths, had a little bit of that, ethereal melodic sound. But then you came back, I think it was in one of those EPs, like Knowledge Breaks, it has these really, really cool breakbeat vibes on it. And then 8-Beat Era was a little faster. Luigi's Magic Mushroom. I obviously the name is a given, but I listened to it and I was like, this could be in a video game. And I'm just curious, kind of in that period, when you reflect back, is that music that you still love? Do you still play those tracks out? Or when you look back at that earlier phase for you, is it kind of like, I've moved on from those now?
A little bit of both, I guess. If I look back on that period, I see myself as someone that was still, learning to produce music and also learning his own preference. And because I was working with someone in trance on the one hand, and I was working with Nick Hogendorn, a good friend of mine, on the other hand, who was much more into sort of minimal and the B pitch sound. I was getting all these different influences, and I was just releasing a lot of records, and basically I was releasing everything that I made. And so if I look back critically now on that period, I'm thinking there's definitely records that stood the test of time, but there's also records that sound very dated by now. And there's definitely a few that I probably wouldn't even remember. If I see the name, I'd have to hear them to think like, oh yeah, that was this tune, I totally forgot about it. So I'm still playing some of them for sure. Like Luigi's Magic Mushroom is still a favorite of mine, and I definitely work that into sets every now and then. But a lot of music from that era for my hand that's sort of just faded away,
Definitely.
Yeah.
You have a couple tracks over the years where you've done like a part 1 and a part 2. I'm just curious, when something like that comes up, are you in the studio making the first version and you just feel like I have to continue this one, or is it planned ahead that you want to do a 2-parter?
No, it's sometimes I've done it a few times. You're right. It's usually when I feel there's more to a tune than what I did with it. So, for instance, in the Orde van de Nacht, the original is quite sort of progressive and quite deep. And then I did a part 2 version, which is much more focused on the melody and on the vocals, and it has a breakbeat. And it could have been maybe a remix by someone else, but it's this feeling that I have that I'm not completely done with a certain record. And then I sometimes name them part 1 and part 2. And I think I did the same with Luigi's Magic Mushroom. The original was the record as is. And then for part 2, we did this breakbeat also, and a bit more of a string arrangement in the background to give it more of a melodic sort of touch. So yeah, I like to do that when I feel there's more to a tune than just the one record.
It's great. Around, I think 2010, you started getting into some work kind of on the Hollywood, film entertainment side of things, scoring movie trailers, ads, video games. I was just curious, how did that come about? Like, were you approached for it, or did you just decide that you wanted to jump into it? And how different is it for you working on projects like that rather than, creating music for yourself?
It's a good question. It was a result of my manager asking me early 2008, like, what do you want to do? Not 5 years from now, but maybe 10 or 15 years from now. And one of my answers to that question was, well, I'd like to write music for, maybe film or TV or something. So I started trying to write some tracks that I thought would fit a movie or a series. And they started to, my managers, they started to try and get in touch with Hollywood-based agencies, that are sort of the link between the artist and the movie business. And it went surprisingly quickly, actually. Like, we got in touch with Pusher Music, who I'm still working with in LA. And they heard something in my sound. So I got to try a couple of sort of, like pitches. And it was pretty soon, I guess, that the first one landed. So maybe 2010 or 11 or so. And I spent a lot of time writing records for TV after that, and some of them ended up in loads of movie trailers. And it's still something I really enjoy right now. The last couple of years have been a focus a little bit more on me as an artist than me as a trailer producer, sort of. But it's still something I'm interested in and that I would like to, continue working. Also because it's quite different from the music that I write. When I start to write an electronic dance track or something, you have unlimited possibilities and you can go in any direction, And when it's like a movie pitch or something, it's usually like, okay, we're searching for this and that. So it's really like boxed off. And then you've got 2 days to come up with it, so there's quite a challenge to writing to those kinds of pitches, and I've always enjoyed that.
Yeah, I was just curious, is there a particular project that you worked on over the years that like really stood out to you or was particularly fun or challenging?
Whew. One of the things that I loved working on, and I have to say up front, I didn't make the pitch, unfortunately. I ended up second, but when they renewed the Star Wars franchise with that first movie 4 or 5 years ago or so, I was also writing on that for the trailer, and it almost ended up in there, except someone else took the win. But I really loved, working on something like this, working a melody that I've known as, for as long as I can remember. Those original movies were from before I was born, the first one, and then getting to work with that and giving your own sort of interpretation of that is really amazing.
That's amazing. Wow. I would have liked to see that.
Yeah.
After Luigi's Magic Mushroom, which, it's good to hear. I'm happy to hear that that's one that you still kind of play out, because it really makes sense, because it felt like after that track, you started to get a little more firmly into like the melodic house and techno sound that I think people now associate you with, whether it was like On the Edge 2011, the Memoirs with Anjuna Deep, Kittens of Mass Destruction, Stand Up. I'm just kind of curious, in that time period, I'm wondering if you could just take us into the studio a little bit in your mind. You were building a lot of complex melodies and experimenting with vocals and unique instrumental patterns. What was this period of creation like for you? And did you feel like the live side was also matching this development?
I think that was a period where I was still sort of searching for my sound. And even though you can definitely hear that melodic element as a sort of main thing throughout all the tracks in that period, I was still trying to find what sound I really wanted to give to people, I guess. So a lot of records in that period were still sort of going one way or going the other way. And for instance, that one, the On the Edge you mentioned, definitely still has a bit of those trance roots in them. And then some of the other records that I did in that time, I was much more inspired by, Cocoon and what Sven Väth was doing. I did these tracks, Rauwdauer and Rampenstamper, both Dutch names, by the way, which has always fascinated me. But those were more inspired by that sort of Cocoon sound, where I was just finding a whole different part of the dance floor that I wasn't that familiar with until that time. So even though I guess from the outside, it might have looked like there was a solid plan behind it, I was just sort of going into the studio and doing all these little ideas. And then when one sort of stuck and I thought, oh, this is nice, I finished it. And then I searched for, what label would this fit with, So I was working with a lot of different labels also at the time, because I felt like I could never sort of bundle all of my sounds and release them on one label, because there was so much difference between a lot of those records at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to touch on your connection with Armada. You've obviously you've released with them over the years, as we discussed. You used to make trance, you guest spot on ASOT Radio, and your label is connected with Armada as well. Wondering if you could just tell us kind of how you first connected with them and what's the relationship like with Armin, and how does it feel to you to be working with a guy that you used to look up to?
It's been a really good relationship. Like you said, I've been in touch with them from very, very early onwards, when they started the company already. But back in those days, they were starting as a trance label, and it was just around the time when I was moving deeper, So I guess in those first 10 years, we didn't really work together that much. I think Armada was launched in maybe 2003 or so, or two, maybe, I guess. And that was just around the time when I was releasing my first records. And 2005, I was already moving deeper, So, those first 10 years, we weren't in touch that much. But eventually, I got to this point, I guess it was around 2015, where, like I said before, I had so many different sounds and feelings that I was looking to release in one label, but I felt like I never really felt at home anywhere, because I was working a lot with Tool Room at the time, and they could do some of my more up-tempo clubby tracks. And then I was doing a couple of songs with Spinning, which had a little bit more of a commercial edge. And I was working with Hernan's label, Subbeat, where we were doing deeper things, and so I was sort of in search for one place to do all of that, maybe start my own label or something. And right about at that time, my old publisher, Jeroen Terrehorst, he was working for EMI. He made a move to go to Armada. And so I thought, hey, this is interesting, and we basically approached him and saying like, hey, Eelke is, thinking about starting his own label. Is this something that you would be interested in doing this together? And they were very excited right away, and that was sort of the foundation for Days Like Nights. And so the first record that I released there was also named Home, because that was something that I was, searching for quite a long time already. And finally, after all those years, I thought, okay, this is like a place called home now, and this is where I can do all my music,
No, absolutely. And I mean, when you look through your catalog, it's so clear, because like you start the label and then it's like everything is out on the label for you. And I think it's really awesome to be able to have that opportunity. I'm glad you mentioned it, because I wanted to go there. For the uninitiated listening, I think running and maintaining a label and, having success with it and having a sound, it's a lot easier said than done. And obviously, there's a whole team that works on it, and it requires a lot of work. I'm just curious if you could give us a little bit of insight into kind of what went into starting it and, building it out to a place that you're happy with.
Yeah, it is definitely a lot of work, from sort of 2006 until 2011, I used to run my own label called Outside the Box, which was really all run and handled by me. And, doing all of that work right, it's basically a full-time job. And I quickly noticed, like, if you want to bring this to the next level, you really can't do it alone, because you need someone that is really spending time on the label, being in touch with the artist, with the distribution, on all that. And if you're trying to do that next to your career as a producer and a DJ, all of those things are going to suffer. So after we made the decision to do another label, Days Like Nights, with Armada, that was also a deliberate choice, because they have the right people to, take care of all of those things. So they can take care of accounting, they can do the artwork, they can do contracts and those kind of things. And that's also a very specific and sort of labor intensive area that I don't want to dive too much into that, because contracts is not my experience. And it's much nicer if other people do that, So I like to focus on the creative element, signing the music and getting new artists on board. And then once we get to the sort of the formal side, that's where Armada always steps in, and they do the distribution and the handling. And yeah, it works really, really well like that, to have specific people on specific places to do it all.
Are there any artists that you've had the opportunity to bring into the family over the last couple of years that are just particularly exciting to you?
Definitely, especially with remixes for my own album. I've with the last album, with Moments of Oscillations is the last album. With Oscillations, I've really been able to get some people on board that I look up to and that I've always enjoyed music by. So we got Tim Green to remix one of the tracks on that album. Mano Latuff remixed one of the tracks on that album. There's so Patrice Baumel did one, and it's all kinds of artists that some of them I've known for a long time, some of them I've only met maybe once, but it always feels like an honor to have someone else remix your record and turn it into something else. So I've in that way I've been able to bring a lot of the artists that I support in my DJ sets also onto the label.
Absolutely. Just going back a little, I just felt like I had to ask, in 2014, as you mentioned with the spin-in releases, and then you had this, you had the John Legend remix, kind of two things. I was curious, just one, how that came up for you. And then obviously, you are more in the underground world. When you get tapped to do a song like that, what's it like for you in the studio where obviously you're trying to, maintain the John Legend song, and he is, such a, I don't know if it's pop or R&B, but such an icon, but you're trying to give it integrity while also being true to your own sound.
Yeah, that can be quite a challenge, to be honest. And I if I look back on that period, like 2014, 15, I was struggling quite a bit at the time because some of the records that I did with spinning, they became pretty big hits, like Eindhoven am Strand here in the Netherlands got into the top 40, and it even made it all the way up to number 9. And so that opens a lot of doors. But at the same time, it's a little bit of a slippery slope, and I've always considered myself an underground artist. But then you do one record, and it's crazy because it's good and it's sort of crossover with the different genres. But you try to sort of repeat that, and the second one might be a little bit more commercial than the third one, and by the time you're at record 5, it's like you don't really recognize what you're making anymore because you're trying to adjust all the time to what you think everyone wants to hear after doing such a hit record. So also with remixes at the time, I found it quite hard to balance what I enjoy as an artist with, what a label wants for someone like John Legend, who they want to push as well as possible, So I remember specifically with this remix that I only wanted to use the refrain, and they wanted me to use the chorus as well. So, but I thought as an underground artist, the refrain was amazing, and then the chorus was maybe not super fitting with my music. And so you always have to strike this balance between these two things. And it cost me quite a bit of stress at the time. And it was one of the main reasons why I didn't release any music in 2016, just because I really needed a year to think about, okay, what do I want out of this? Do I want to continue down this road, or do I want to continue down the underground road? And I was struggling with that for quite a bit in those years.
Well, I appreciate that you touched on that, because I did want to ask, it's interesting. You have such an immense output, and then obviously, there's a little bit of a break in there. As you've alluded to now, you did just put an album out, I think it was last year, and, it's not your first. You've had a couple albums over the years, 2 of them, I think, in the last 3 or 4. I'm just wondering if you could kind of take us inside your mind when it comes to the process of, creating an album versus putting out a single, and how just conceptualizing an album has changed over time for you. I assume that the way you went about it last year is maybe different than you did in 2007.
Yeah. Well, no, maybe not exactly, I guess. Like when I write an album, it's usually, I don't really know I'm starting an album. I just have, 4 or 5 songs that fit together nicely. And I see if I can sort of write an album around that, So, and actually that process in 2007 for my first album was exactly like that. I had 6 tracks ready, and I sent them to Global Underground, and I was like, "Hey guys, do you like this? Do you think this could be an album?" And they liked those first 6 tracks. And then I started working on the rest. And I guess now the difference is like, well, I'll tell my manager and the label and everyone, like, okay, I'm going to start a new album. But the idea is still the same. I write a lot of music, and I try to search for 5 or 6 tracks that sound really well together. And I think, okay, this could be the basis for this album. And then I start to fill in the gaps. Like, okay, it needs a little bit of this, or it needs a little bit of that. Maybe nowadays I approach it a little bit more from an how would you call it? Like maybe an artist perspective or so. So I'm thinking of the sound beforehand, and I'm already thinking about my 5th album, for instance. And I know the kind of sounds that I want in it, and I know the kind of tracks that I would need to write for it. So I have a little bit more of an image beforehand, but it still comes down to writing the music and then picking those 5 or 6 tracks. And then you go like, okay, this is the start, and we'll work from here.
One of the things I just wanted to ask about, you post on social media a decent amount about just different equipment and, synthesizers and keyboards and whatnot. Obviously, I would assume, some of that plays into your live sets, some of it is in your productions.
Yeah.
Could you just tell us about some of your favorite studio tools and synthesizers?
Oh, I'm a bit of a gear freak, and I have way more stuff than I need, but it's just fun twisting knobs, So one of my main things that I use a lot is my modular synthesizer, which is do you want me to put it on video as well?
Sure. Why not?
I'll walk you around the studio a little bit. So my modular synthesizer over here, I built that up from the ground, and it's one of my favorite sort of spots for ideas. I'll just start a patch and think of something, and a lot of tracks have started here, like a Rubicon, Control. Too many to mention. I've always I try to get a nice sort of vibe going here, and then once that's cool, I'll head into the rest of the studio. Then another one of my favorites is the MOOG 1 over here, which is I've had it literally. I was the first one, or one of the first ones in the Netherlands to have one, because I was already on the search for a modular synthesizer. For a polyphonic synthesizer. And right about the time that I was searching, MOOG posted that they were going to release this one, and I was like, okay, this is 1+1. I need it. So this was used extensively on the last album on Oscillations. And then this one is also, this is right in front of me, all my guitar pedals. And it's only been like this for a couple of weeks, maybe a month now. But I've always used my guitar pedals for lots of creative effects and freaking. And I thought I used them so much that I really need them right in front of me. So I built this little pedal board right in front of me, and I basically run half my audio through them. So I guess those 3 together are sort of the basis for any sound. And there's lots more, I can just all these drawers with synths, but I don't use them all the time. They're the most important ones are definitely the ones I just mentioned.
That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. I always like to ask whenever we're doing an interview where the artist is in the studio, it's like, I know it's such a sacred place for you guys. And
yeah.
You've obviously built this out over the years, and to be one of the first people in the country with the MOOG, that's pretty crazy. Because now it feels like such an industry standard tool. One of the things that you did recently, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but Circle or Cercle.
Yes, Circle. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Good. I've always been curious. Some people have given me weird pronunciations, but anyways. You played this set for them, and
I think they've become one of the hottest commodities in our industry recently. It feels like they've kind of cemented themselves as tastemakers. And I think from an artist perspective, it's a pretty awesome sign off when they tap you to produce a set. And also it's, a very unique opportunity for artists to test out a live version of their set as you did.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you could just kind of tell us about the whole experience, what it means to be part of that family now, and how it felt performing your music in such an awe-inspiring location, and the decision to premiere that live set for them.
Well, it was a very overwhelming experience. We'd been in touch with Circle for a while. I guess for a few years, just seeing because it's always nice if you do something like Circle to base it around something new. So in my case, that was the latest album, Oscillations, was sort of the trigger that made it happen. And I'd already played quite a few live shows with the setup in 2018 and 19. But of course, then the whole COVID thing happened. And so when I played the Circle show in March, I think it was at least a year and a half since I had played a live show anywhere, So also for me, it was quite a challenge. I think I spent the 4 weeks leading up to the actual show. I spent those 4 weeks playing the show here at home at least 3 times a day, sometimes more, because I really wanted to be well rehearsed. And Circle, compared to all the other live streams out there, is the only one that is actually live. So it gets recorded and broadcasted on Facebook at exactly the same time that you're playing the show. So any mistake will be in there until the end of time, So you don't want to fuck up. And so there's a lot of pressure to do it right, And so I spent lots of time rehearsing for that. And it was so interesting because coming out of the how do you call it, the COVID winter, I had not seen a crowd in front of me for half a year, and then all of a sudden you're in France with a huge team, 10 plus people working on this show. That's and you start building up in the morning, and then the show is later in the afternoon. And it was just an overwhelming experience. And to be really honest, I don't think I enjoyed the moment that much. I only enjoyed when it was finished and when everything went well, because I was way too focused to sort of even look around and see my surroundings. That all came later when I finally finished and everything went well.
It makes sense. It definitely is a high pressure set, and visually, from a viewer perspective, it was absolutely stunning. Just a follow up, the Mont Saint Michel single that you put out, was that planned in advance to release with them, or was that kind of born out of the live set?
No, that's something that they do since a year or so, maybe a little bit longer. They try to release one song from every live set that they do. So Sébastien Léger released one, and I released one, and Who Made Who released one, and so now they're trying to do that with every artist. And so I definitely went into the studio and I started writing that track. I guess maybe January or February, and playing it at the Mont Saint Michel was also the first time for me, trying this song anywhere. So I did write that specifically for that performance.
That's great. Well, as we're finishing up here, the last thing I just want to ask you about, obviously, coming off the Circle set and your album, I mean, you've had such an accomplished career, and, we're finally returning to live shows pretty soon. For someone like yourself who, is so established and has accomplished so much in your career, what is kind of the next piece for you, or what is it that, you want to accomplish in the next couple of years, whether it's a visual aid on your live set, or it's more focused on scoring films or another album? Just curious kind of what the future holds.
I've got 2, maybe 3 things that really have my focus right now. Like, I want to do a 5th album, and I really want to play more guitar on that. Like, I only started playing guitar maybe 3 years ago, I don't feel comfortable enough on stage yet, but in the studio, I'm getting up to the level where I'm comfortable recording my own guitars, So I've really taken, over the last couple of years, taken an interest into a lot of the, not just indie dance, but also the indie rock scene. And I think my next album will have a bit more crossover towards that sound. So that's one thing I really want to focus on. I want to build the live show more, and that, I guess that's also an extension of that, because if I do an album with more live instruments and more guitar, that's also going to translate well to the live show. So I guess that is sort of step 2. I bring the live show more places around the world also, because I've mostly done it in Europe now. And I also want to continue the my film and TV ventures. Although it's often difficult to really divide your time between all of those, because you can only do so many things really well, So I'm sort of hoping to, how do you say, like if I write an album that has a little bit more of a crossover sound, it might also appeal to the film industry. So we'll see if that actually works out. But that's the way I envision it right now.
Awesome. Well, the last question I have for you is just if there are any up and coming artists that you've been listening to that you just want to give a quick shout out to.
Definitely. Buddha Kid is one of them. He played for us at Days Like Nights last year, and I play a lot of his music. And, he's definitely someone to watch out for. Very talented and doing a lot of good music at the moment. And also Fat Sushi. We've been releasing some of their stuff on the label. And we have one track coming up called Alone with Allies for Everyone. And that's been one of my biggest tracks this whole COVID period. Like everywhere I play it, it just goes off. So we're looking into doing more music with them as well. And I can see really good things for them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time today. This was awesome. I think we'll probably publish this sometime next week or the week after. We'll obviously be in touch. Cool. And it was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. And again, apologies for being late. It was no problem. A little bit of a mix-up, but
no problem at all. All right. Okay. Well, you have a good one, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you too, man. Thank you.